Right, should we make a start, everyone? Morning. I think people are still filtering in, but I'll get cracking because there's quite a bit of information to cover. So this morning we're going to be looking at the 7 deadly sins of microservices. Bit of an intro. Hopefully many of you know what the 7 deadly sins are. They come from sort of Christian ethics back in the day, kind of human vices, things we must avoid to maintain our, sainthood. If you're not familiar with the Christianity stuff or don't like that, also SpongeBob SquarePants, funnily enough, relates to the 7 deadly sins. I learned this actually a couple of years ago at DevOps. Marcus Esau was presenting, and he had to tone down his presentation due to the policy of DevOps. But we're very kind of good about what we sort of present on the screen, and he actually converted his Deadly Sins presentation into a SpongeBob-themed presentation. So if you read about it, it actually is a real thing. So here's what we're going to talk about today. It's a bit of a list, let's say 7 things: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, pride, all related to microservice projects I've worked on over the last 5 or so years, I guess now. Hopefully several of you saw me yesterday, but just a brief intro again. I work for a company called OpenCredo, and I also work for Container Solutions as well. And OpenCredo, we're a consultancy, so I do lots of agile, change management. My technical specialties, DevOps, that kind of stuff. I am a developer, Java developer. I've done microservices in cloud, let's say for the last 5 or so years. And Container Solutions, we do R&D around Docker, Mesos, Kubernetes, all that new hotness, which I'm going to be advising you to be careful of in a minute. But if you do want to get involved, give me a shout. It's really cool tech, actually. It's really good fun. I also write for various places. I'll put a link up at the end. If you're interested in what I'm saying today and want to know more, I write for InfoQ, DZone, Vox, that kind of thing, and you can hopefully check out some more stuff then. So let's dive in. First off, what is a microservice? And I like these 2 definitions. Adrian Cockcroft of Netflix fame, eBay son as well, says a microservice is a loosely coupled service-oriented architecture with bounded contexts. Now, bounded context comes from DDD. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but I really like that in terms of it's kind of like the new SOA, or SOA done right. A bit of a cliche, but I really quite like that. And Applications That Fit Into Your Head by James Lewis. Now, James kind of arguably kicked this stuff off around microservices about quite a few years ago now when I did Java, the Unix way talk, which is well worth watching. And the joke is that if you can, sort of fit the actual code in your head, it's kind of like a microservice, or it's small enough to be a microservice. The joke is, James has got quite a large head, and if he puts his head on the monitor and he can get the code, size of his head, it's also microservice worthy as well. So a bit of a little joke there. That's quite a good one. So first off, our first deadly sin is lust, and it's using the latest and greatest tech. Now, I think we're all guilty to some degree of this, aren't we, as techies? We love, interesting stuff. We love to play around with stuff. So I'm going to do this in 2 parts. I'm going to say microservices, relatively newish kind of tech, and then we're going to look at the actual tech supporting microservices as well. So microservices solve all our problems, right? Just like everything else before, ESB in the past, there's always the new hotness that's going to be a silver bullet, which in reality, anyone who's been in the industry for more than a few years realizes that is not the case yet. Microservices in particular aren't necessarily good for speed. If you're a startup, you haven't got your business model yet, and to be honest, a monolith is a perfectly good way to start. And actually, hot off the press here, this is Russ Miles talking. He did a very good talk last year at Skills Matter about, I think he had 3 projects. It was all anecdotal comparison, but he compared 3 very similar projects, one doing microservices, one doing a monolith, and one doing a monolith with the idea of microservices in the future. And he compared them, and he said, if you're sort of finding your business model, the monolith was faster, which is quite interesting. And I don't know if any of you have seen that Martin Fowler and Stefan Tilkov have been having quite an interesting chat of the last week or 2 about, should we do a monolith first, that kind of thing. So it's very interesting. If you're finding out your business model, nothing wrong with using something like Groovy or Rails or Grails or anything like that. Chuck it up on Heroku, get it out there, get the business model verified, and then look about making the architecture really sound. And on that note of architecture, it's not always, the microservices aren't always relevant here. So I really like Simon Brown's quote. Hopefully a few of you saw Simon Brown's talk yesterday. The reason I invited him to the conference was because he's such an awesome speaker, and I've learned so much from Simon. And he says, if you can't build a well-structured monolith, what makes you think microservices are the answer? And that's like a really good question, isn't it? Yeah, And when I first heard that, I was like, oh yeah, there's probably some middle ground that a lot of us could benefit from. We've got our monolith. We've got this sort of SOA vision, if you like, we may never attain. So why not do something in the middle? Something modular, something well architected. We'll look a bit more about that later on. But also on the opposite end of the spectrum, if perhaps you haven't got the necessary design or architecture skills in-house, opposite end of the spectrum is when you're so good at architecture, you don't need microservices. Now, Etsy are very famous for doing a monolithic stack, as are Stack Overflow. And apologies for the graphics are a bit skewed here, as unfortunately was a scaling issue this morning. But Etsy, yep, PHP-based monolith, they serve like crazy amounts of traffic, and they push to production so many times a day. They've really invested in their DevOps skills. And the famous thing about Stack Overflow, I saw this at QCon last week, QCon New York, and they've got, basically they call it box, arrow, cylinder. You think about that as microservices, it'd be box, arrow, boxes, loads of boxes, that kind of thing. And they scale through power, and unfortunately, they are really beastly servers. That's 2 HA proxy servers at the front, 9 web servers, 4 MySQL. It's a .NET stack, actually. And they're crazy. I think they've got like 0.5 terabyte of RAM in the actual the hot standbys here and that kind of thing. So they do scale via performance. But when I was hearing this talk, it really made me think like, wow, yeah, if you've got really good architecture skills, you probably don't need, to move to microservices. You can work within the code base because it's so well architected, so well, componentized. And it really made me think sort of the opposite ends of the architectural spectrum. Quite interesting. And operational maturity is vital. So if you're looking to move to microservices, there's a whole bunch of things that go with it. The dev stuff that we're going to look at, there's the business stuff, and there's clearly the operational stuff. We'll look at that a bit more, but Martin Fowler did a great article. You must be this tall to use microservices, which I thought was great. So microservices are very useful, but check your use case. They are not a panacea. I know it's an obvious statement, but I like to say it because I get caught up in the hype sometimes. They are not a panacea, though. And evaluation is a key skill, both in terms of using microservices, but also in terms of certain tech within microservices. Docker, Mesos, Kubernetes, all fantastic, but they've got a good use case, or you need to have a good use case to use them, I should say. So I'm going to share with you a really nice quote I like about evaluation. It says, "I will postpone using this shiny new framework until my peers have validated the proposed benefits with rigorous scientific experiments." And this was, of course, said by no programmer ever. Yeah, we're attracted. We're magpies or blackpies. We're attracted by the shiny, and we can't help ourselves sometimes. But really, do think about this stuff. Yeah, we basically do software alchemy. Yeah, we're not software engineers really yet. If you look at other engineering disciplines, they're much more rigorous than we are in their application of science. So I'm trying as a professional to move towards this. I'm not perfect by any means, but I like to spread the gospel in terms of do have a think about when you're adopting new technologies. Great article by actually someone from Etsy, Dan McKinley, Choose Boring Technology. Optimize across the organization. Particularly if you're a big enterprise, you're going to be having lots of different pockets of technology. And when you're moving to microservices, you want to standardize. There's nothing worse than having lots of disparate stacks and then trying to bring them back together. It's the same problem as you're kind of solving already, if that makes sense. You've got ESB over here, different broker over here, ActiveMQ here, RabbitMQ here, that kind of thing. We'll look a bit more about that in a second, but choose boring tech. And I think in the Java world, Java and even Spring Boot are kind of boring, yeah? Spring Boot, I love Spring Boot. I mustn't be careful with the Spring guys, I don't care. But I love Spring Boot. But it's kind of like quite a standard tech. It's fundamentally the Spring stack under the hood, wrapped in a really nice kind of layer. And we've got a current client I'm working with, Java 8 and Spring Boot microservices in production, and it's been a fantastic experience. Java 8 is awesome with its lambdas, that kind of thing, and its streams. And Spring Boot is just it's a little bit heavyweight in deployment in the runtime, but in the design time, it gives you some great primitives to work with. So you can look at cool things like Ratpack and all these other things. Ratpack's really cool for getting services up quick and very quick. But I'm all for if developers I walk into an organization and developers are comfortable with Java, comfortable with Spring, this for me is the right choice. It depends on use case, obviously. Tomcat, Jetty, I think, are perfectly fine for deploying microservices. Tomcat, some organizations really, they like Tomcat. They're happy with Tomcat operationally. Jetty's quite nice and in-memory server. That's probably my preference. But, they're kind of boring tech, but they're perfectly adequate for deploying microservices. If you are going to introduce new tech, I'm a massive fan of Matt Rabel's comparison framework. It removes a little bit of the subjectivity. So, for example, this is the original Matt Rabel blog post. He was comparing web frameworks. So, this is back in the day, Struts 2, Spring, Wicket, JSF. And you see the criteria down there on the y-axis. And you can share this amongst your team. Yeah, so you can say if we're going to bring in we're looking for a microservice framework, we'll have Spring Boot, Ratpack, Grails, that kind of thing. And then you might say, I need developer productivity, I need good documentation, I need operational skills, and then you can score it on any kind of scale you want. amongst your team, and then bring these things together, and you can kind of weigh up, like, as a team, decision, why you want to choose a certain thing. And the real benefit of this is you get documentation as to why you've chosen something. All too often, as a consultant, I rock up to a client and I say, I see you're using, Ruby on Rails there. I see you using Play Framework. Why is that? And more often than not, it's like, don't know. Sometimes I get, the vendor sold it to us, which is marginally better than not knowing. But really, you should, if you're choosing something, a technology, you should have a record of why you chose it. Things might change in the future, and we can go back and reevaluate this kind of thing. The second deadly sin I want to talk about is gluttony, excessive communication protocols. Now, I go into a lot of organizations, and I can't name names, actually, got really careful, but I often see like a crazy amount of things gluing other things together. And if you're doing microservices, I say standardize across the organization again. Choose, if you can, one synchronous protocol to start with and one async protocol. That gives you a nice flexibility. You've got sort of peer-to-peer, synchronous communication, async stuff for batch operations or stuff that's not necessary in real time. I like JSON over HTTP as a start. It's nice and easy. It's well supported. I like RabbitMQ, to be honest, for that. But there's plenty of options, yeah? I'd say don't gold plate. If you are looking for things like increased speed, a binary protocol like protobufs and Thrift and Google's new gRPC is really cool. It's not human readable, but that's often not a massive factor, to be honest. I think we've oversold the human readability of JSON and XML because ultimately it's machines to machines communicating. But Thrift and protobufs also give you nice. They're an IDL or an interface definition language, so they give you sort of version schema of the protocol you're communicating with, which is really quite nice as well. 0MQ, MQTT are lightweight asynchronous messaging protocols. They're super cool, super fast. But again, they're kind of gold plating if you're just doing, poking things, do this, do that. Know your options, don't gold plate. I did actually an article about 6 months ago now, I think it was, around Java one time, about doing microservices in the enterprise. If you're using sort of heavyweight ESBs, heavyweight messaging protocols, I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but check out this guide. Marcus, actually, I mentioned earlier on, also did an article in this one as well, talking about sort of the integration pathway over the years of how we've arrived at sort of the notion of ESB versus lightweight messaging technology, that kind of thing. So a bit more information if you do want to know about sort of how to bring in and manage communication protocols within an enterprise stack, a bit more of a heavy stack. So that was a short one, that one. The third sin is greed. Yeah, all our service are belong to us. And this essentially is looking at the organizational impact of microservices. Now, it is, in my opinion, massively underestimated. Yeah, if you're going to leverage microservices, you need to be, in terms of development, good. Operationally, we'll look at in a minute. You need to be good there, but you need to be good at an organizational level. And I'm sure some of you are guessing what's coming. It is the obligatory mention of Conway's Law. Every microservice talk has to talk about Conway's Law. And yes, it's a cliche, but for a good reason. Yeah, Conway says, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structure of the organization. Now, in a nutshell, for us, I think, what I see most as well, it's silos. Yeah, we have dev to QA to ops. There's handoffs, there's delays. Fundamentally, it's lack of cohesion, lack of shared understanding, and lack of joint accountability. Yeah. Now, it's very easy to joke, isn't it, saying, dev, QA, and ops are all different people, different goals, that kind of thing. But fundamentally, we're all working with the same goal for the company. We're going to deploy software, we're going to make money, we're going to have some fun as well. Yeah. We need to increase the cohesion between all these silos. And the problem as well with these silos, further compounded, there's silos within the silos, particularly in big organizations, yeah. You get front-end people, middleware, database, they don't talk to each other, it's kind of crazy. And this is compounded again and again. Yeah, and you kind of wonder how software gets built sometimes, don't you, with this kind of thing? And then you look at some of the projects that do get built. And I'm ragging totally on healthcare.gov. I'm sure many of you heard the story about how this went live, fell over constantly. We're just as bad in the UK. There's an NHS project I know of that is publicly talked about, was just as bad. Not quite as high profile as healthcare.gov over in the States. But this is how US citizens have to buy their healthcare, for example. And it was like a lot of sort of politics around it, a lot of legal framework around it. But it was just such a big project, so many people, so much money involved, and they still couldn't deliver on time. There was a great talk actually by Nori Heikkinen, I think she's called. Fantastic talk at QCon New York last week, which I wrote up for InfoQ. So if you go onto InfoQ and look, the actual title of the article is called Too Big to Fail. And she talks about her time as a site reliability engineer for Google and for healthcare.gov. She went in and triaged some of the stuff. And it was such a toxic environment in there that, for example, one person crashed the login system, crashed the database. Red alert going off, craziness going off. And apparently this person was sat next to the war room. There was all these alarms going off. And this person was running like a really crazy query on the database and was crashing the whole site, knew about it, but didn't speak up because he feared he would lose his job. And this is madness. It's such a toxic environment. I'm not doing the story full justice, but have a look at that's my article. And if you can, have a look at Nori's talk. Nori is just a fantastic talk about how things go wrong in big organizations and how we should try to fix these things. So cross-functional teams seem to be the way forward. You've got to work on culture in general. Spotify are amazing at this. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the Spotify video about how they sort of organize their teams. And cross-functional just means you're not like a team of middleware people. You're not a team of front-end people. You're cross-functional in that, within your team, you might have a front-end specialist, a back-end specialist, operations, QA, PM, that kind of thing. Spotify, they've been doing this for a long time. It's an advanced pattern how they do things. Amazon famously do their 2 pizza teams. I'm sure many of you have heard of 2 pizzas. Teams that cannot be fed by, the team size mustn't be any bigger than can be fed by 2 pizzas, is the joke. But it's really good. And the reason they did it is to cut the communication channels. When you've got teams that are hundreds big, you as an individual have got like 99 other people to talk to. If you keep the teams around 10, 12, 2 pizza size, it's much easier much faster to communicate things. And Guilt. I really like Guilt. They're a flash sales luxury band website in the States. Check them out. They do some really cool stuff. They're just getting on the microservice sort of sharing bandwagon now. They've been using microservices for quite a few years. But the reason they switched to microservices and they changed their organization was around strategic alignment. They gave teams sort of declarative goals. We want to increase conversion. We want to increase stickiness. And they basically said to their teams, do what you want. And ultimately, they converge to Scala-based microservices around each strategic alignment. And it's a fascinating story they've shared, so do check them out. But fundamentally, as much as we kind of, loud at kind of Conway's law, Conway was telling the truth, yeah? That's why often with cliches, there is some truth behind it. We have to deal with it. Yeah, and it's maybe not necessarily your job, but if you're a developer, if you're an architect, but I think it kind of is. We're all leaders to some degree within the organization, and we need to push change up and down in the organization. The Connected Company talks about a lot of the Amazon stuff, the 2 pizza teams, how to create organizations around these kind of, more... the Connected Company is versus the Divided Company. Divided Company is siloed, lots of handoffs, which I've already shown. The Connected Company is this kind of new microservice type model from a business perspective. The modern firm talks about that as well. It's more business-oriented, but how you should kind of structure your organization, your teams to leverage kind of a microservice technology. And then don't kid yourself, you're going to be doing change management. If you're a team lead, that kind of thing, or an architect, you are going to be doing change management in terms of bringing microservices in. They are a very disruptive technology, up and down the hierarchy, and across the tech stack as well. QA, for example, is really cool. It's often changed with microservices, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a minute. Great books, great recommendations, I hope there, that I've certainly got a lot of value out of. The 4th pattern is Sloth, creating a distributed monolith. Now, if you can't deploy your microservices independently, there is an argument that says you're not doing microservices. You're doing a distributed monolith. And I think Arun did a great talk yesterday around, and he said, you're like distributed bags of dust if you've got like a monolith kind of thing. And it's very true. And I've done this myself in a couple of projects. One was because we didn't have our bounded contexts right. We didn't kind of model our organization correctly, and things leaked, so we had to deploy 2 services at the same time to get the sort of re-updating the model. Like both parts had to go into production at the same time because they contained the model. We hadn't got our bounded, we hadn't defined the business context, that we were actually deploying correctly. I've also had along data fault lines. We were using Solar, Elasticsearch, we've seen that kind of thing. And we'd wrapped Solar with a wrapper that did some sort of business logic for us. And there were several, it was kind of like a satellites around it. And we had to deploy all these things at one go because we didn't get our data fault lines right. And when I say fault lines, I mean it's like, think of like tectonic plates, where things are shifting, where things are changing, where things are being transformed. That is often a good boundary for a microservice. We messed it up. We had to deploy these 5 things at one go, and then we learned the lesson the hard way. Then we decoupled things. We got our fault lines a bit more correct. We transformed things at a more appropriate level in the stack, that kind of thing. I'm not going to talk about it in this sin, but there's also check you've separated deploy and release. This is a key thing. Even if you're using a monolith, this is a really good thing. Feature flagging, that kind of thing. Yeah, you turn things on and off. Really good. Etsy are freaking awesome at this. They've done a very simple thing with PHP. I think they've open sourced it as well, which is really good. But again, microservices, it's even more of a challenge because you're often deploying lots of things into production with things turned off, and then you have to turn them on. And that might turn on functionality in several different services. How do you test that kind of thing? But you do need to separate deploy and release. Otherwise, you have to do like I did with my story. You have when our feature flag was essentially us deploying stuff and crossing our fingers, which is not a good strategy. I learned the hard way there. The client wasn't happy, which fair enough, yeah. Now, it's interesting around creating sort of the contract around microservices. There's a couple of different approaches. The first is schema-first design. And Michael from Gilt did a great talk actually at QCon New York last week. And he's created a tool called API Doc. It's a little bit like Swagger, but slightly more automatable, and in terms of generation, and you can generate clients from it as well. It's quite opinionated, and Michael's not being shy about that. It is very opinionated, even more so perhaps than Swagger for documenting things. But also, it allows you to do some kind of upfront design of my microservice has this schema, and it's at this version. And the tool allows you to sort of evolve the interface. It builds even Java clients with it uses semantic versioning. I'm not sure if you're familiar with semantic versioning. So you have major, minor, patch, like 1.1.1, that kind of thing. And it gives like a sort of like a Git-like change log in the API as it's changed. And when you do like a major change, you bump the major version, so it's 2.1.1. It is a little bit upfront design. So people are a little bit conscious of that. Is that a good thing? But it's worked really well in Gilt. And Gilt have got over like 200 microservices in production running at high load. So I respect that. It works for them. Martin Fowler and crew talk a lot about consumer-driven contracts. And I think this is a fantastic idea. It's moving basically the schema from the supplier, from the service, the service saying, I offer you this. It's moving it to the consumer. So the consumer says, I need this. And then you can run tests against, all your consumers, this one supplier. Well, supplier at one might say, consumer one might say, I need this. Consumer two says, I need this. Consumer three says, I need this. Provided your supplier meets all those three contracts, tests pass. Yeah, and we've often used it in organizations where, it's not a problem if the contract has to change, but it's a cue for a conversation. Yeah, as a consumer, I need something a bit different. Oh, that's broken the tests. Therefore, I'll have a chat with the people that run the supplier. It might even be in my team, for example. The only snag with this, if it's done right, it's kind of consumer-driven contracts is kind of behavior-driven development for microservices. I love behavior-driven development. Yeah, John Smart, fantastic talk yesterday on that stuff. But the only snag is the technology is not quite there yet. There's the PACT framework, which is very interesting, and ThoughtWorks are working on something called PACTO, which is kind of like a slightly different version of it. And I heard from Dave Sire yesterday, actually really interesting, that there's something coming into Spring Boot, perhaps, from, I think it was For Finance, the team was called. So I'm really looking forward to that, actually, as well. I think it's an amazing idea, and it totally makes sense when you start working with microservices at scale. The implementation is not quite there yet. I've really struggled in my current gig, actually, to get this kind of thing working. And we've got it working, but it's a bit fragile at times. Things like PACT, even if you change headers, like dates and stuff, it breaks, which you don't want that, really. You want to say this, this shouldn't break if the time alters, because obviously we're testing at different times, that kind of thing. But it's a really nice idea. So upfront design, or sort of the supplier definition, or the consumer definition. Check it out. And I'm going to use this now to sort of skew in a bit of architecture as well. As much as you must get the service boundaries correctly, the contracts correct, architecture is vital, yeah? Now, hopefully, a few of you saw Simon Brown yesterday. Awesome stuff. Architecture, for me, it's not enterprise ivory tower architecture. It's about technical leadership. It's about communication. It's about the shared vision I mentioned in the keynote yesterday. And promoting a shared understanding within the team. This is really key, yeah. And fantastic book by Simon, Lean Pub book. He's got a great website, codingthearchitecture.com. Please do check it out. And because we do a lot of domain-driven design-inspired stuff in microservices, I always recommend this when I go into a company as well. For me, it's all about, as well, just enough upfront design. Now, I think many of us have been stung by big upfront design in the past, and we're almost skewing to the other way now, as in, doing everything very agile. But agile is not an excuse to be sloppy. Yeah, and this is the point that Simon makes, and I really buy into it. We need to do just enough upfront design. I can't give you a rule for that. It's something I think we develop, and I'm still learning for sure. It's something we develop over time about how much to do up front. But I saw a great talk actually by Sarah yesterday, and she was saying like we're skewing sort of away from that kind of stuff now. The committee-driven, like we must design our architecture like this, we must gold plate for the future. And I really like what she was saying in terms of, that is bad, but we need to do just enough upfront design as well. So that kind of really hard balance, really hard. I do struggle with it. The fifth sin I want to talk about is wrath, blowing up when bad things happen. Yeah, and microservices are inherently, well, maybe not inherently, but the way they're deployed, working on a distributed computing environment. Yeah, so this is a big challenge for a lot of us. I'm lucky to study at uni, distributed computing, so I know some of the basics, and I've got some very amazing colleagues that help me with this stuff. But I don't think organizations realize this quite enough when I go in to see them. They're like, microservices, how different can it be? But a lot of stuff now is going to be going over the wire when it used to be an in-process call. That kind of thing, yeah. And then you're liable to things like the 8 fallacies of distributed computing. If you guys haven't read about 8 fallacies of distributed computing, please do. It's really interesting. Like things like, people think the bandwidth is unlimited, the latency is 0, and even if you're in like an amazingly ran data center, that is just not the case, yeah. And people like Google and Amazon are totally aware of that stuff, and they're quite open about that kind of thing as well. But my pitch for this kind of stuff is a few things we're going to cover, but it's bring in Michael Nygaard for your dev team and bring in some monkeys for the operations. Yeah. So how many of you read Release It? I always like to ask this. Oh, it's getting better. Brilliant. I'd like more, to be honest. This is an amazing book. But it's 10 years old now. It's kind of around when the cloud stuff was just coming out. But it talks about fundamental fault-tolerant patterns. And I'm sure many of you use design patterns every day. Use MVC, singleton, strategy, that kind of thing. But fault tolerance patterns are things like timers, retries, bulkheads, circuit breakers. You've probably got Hystrix, very popular. Netflix's Hystrix, sorry. But you don't need necessarily to use a particular tool. It's the concepts that are really important. When you're working in a distributed environment, you need to code a lot more defensively. And this is a great book for priming you. So please, if you go away and read this stuff, it's gold. And once, as a development team, we've got this stuff, operationally, you need to be testing these things. It's all very well to say, we're doing all this great fault-tolerant stuff, but you need to test it. And the Simian Army, gets a lot of publicity, but it really is super cool. Yeah, I've got it working on a couple of gigs, and there's like a conformity monkey, latency monkey, this kind of thing. And it's not hard to get working. You need to be quite operationally proficient, but there's plenty of people out there that sort of really like this stuff. And it's a great way to test that what we think we're doing, we are actually doing. Because again, we're no longer testing and prodding one thing, we're testing a microservice, a distributed environment, yeah. Now, Martin Fowler talks about the prerequisites. You must be this tall to use microservices. And basically he's saying continuous delivery is a microservice prerequisite. Here's 3 things where you need rapid provisioning, basic monitoring, and rapid application deployment. Fundamentally, agile and DevOps, yeah. Now, we're looking at this more from an operational concern, because really, my pitch is you need to look at it from an organizational point of view, and you need to look at it even the business point of view. Arguably, you need some kind of lean stuff in there as well, because if your business can't take advantage of all this opportunity to deploy lots of new stuff fast, what's the point in doing it? Technically, it's kind of cool. We're happy as developers and operators, but yeah, it's microservices offers a fantastic opportunity, but you must take advantage of it in all levels of the organization. But anyway, I digress a little bit there. Coming back onto the operational concerns, the technical ones, yeah, you do need to have a look at these things. Things like, Puppet, Chef, Ansible. I'm really loving Ansible, actually, and Terraform are really cool. I know I said, be careful of the new hotness and stuff, and new frameworks popping up all the time, but stuff I'm working on with like Mesos, Docker, Kubernetes, I'm loving Ansible, I'm loving Terraform for defining infrastructure. And once I've defined it, then I can trash stuff, bring it up really quickly. It's super cool. So if you haven't been familiar with the continuous delivery, or you don't do it within your organization, this is a fantastic book. Jez Humble, Dave Farley, it's a long-standing book, but the concepts in it are amazing. And again, it's much like the Release It book. Go in and read it, and then map it on to where you are in your organization. Maybe Ansible's not the right fit for you. Maybe shell scripts are fine. Maybe Puppet's fine, that kind of thing. But please do think, these 3 things are really important from an operational, technical point of view. Okay? The next thing, operational, the social side of operators. Now, failure happens all the time. in a distributed environment, in a microservice environment. Werner Vogels, CTO of Amazon, is very famous. It's, failure happens all the time in the cloud. You've got to get used to it. And I mentioned Nori's presentation earlier on. She was talking about in Google, they regularly run game day or disaster in recovery testing and dirt sessions where they actually start pulling plugs. It's like a real-life chaos monkey type thing. And they test what their teams do, who gets paged, who gets called, who gets reacted, who reacts and what happens. If it goes to a customer-facing thing, they pull the plug on the actual test, for example. They're very conscious as to not affect their users. But they figured that you have to get used to how failure happens. And Nori talked about this fantastic story about how the Atlanta metro data center broke in Google. Atlanta apparently disappeared off their network map. And it was all due to the fact of a bug in a new router they were using. And they were trying to query the CPU stats of the router. And the old router was indexed at 0. The new router was indexed at 1. And when they did SMTP to query the status of the CPU on a sort of 0-indexed array, the actual router fell down and it killed the whole connection to the data center. And you imagine in Google there was alarms going off, everyone's going crazy, and they handled it pretty well, but they learned that we need to get even better at handling this stuff. We never thought about a whole metro region disappearing. And that's my experience. All the stuff that goes wrong, I've typically not thought about that much. So you need to do real stuff, yeah. It's not easy, and this is more of an advanced pattern, but just bear it in mind. We need to get, as developers and operators and architects, we need to get this kind of thing in, failure happens all the time. We need to actually test when it happens and what we do about it. Do we run around like headless chickens or do we handle it? Yeah. And my experience, that when it first happens, we're more like headless chickens. Then we get better. Quite interesting from Netflix. Now, Netflix are actually moving away from the Chaos Monkey stuff a little bit now, which I think is interesting, because they got burned, apparently, by Latency Monkey. So they were running Latency Monkey. Latency Monkey injects latency into services. But it was hard to contain sometimes where the latency was being injected. And famously, it took out a couple of actual user-facing services that it wasn't meant to, and users were impacted. And not in a bad way, because all the fault-tolerant stuff that Netflix are famous for cut in, and stuff got sort of fell back into other services. But developers then, because it caused end users pain, got more conscious about using some of the Chaos Monkey stuff. So they needed some other way to do testing, to keep, they've got a very sort of anti-fragile approach to software and to their actual development as well. Yeah, in terms of they're an so they've created famously anti-fragile development process. And anti-fragile is kind of the opposite of fragile. Yeah, it's kind of we learn from failure, basically. So they've created this tool. They haven't open sourced it yet, but they've started talking about it, called failure injection testing. And it allows them to, they've got a proxy thing at the front end called Zool, like HA proxy or whatever, and it allows them to identify traffic coming into there and sort of, do various failure scenarios to it. So they're in QCon New York, the guy actually, Colton was demonstrating, he actually took his Netflix account and injected certain failures to it live in the presentation. And he was actually looking at his Netflix site, and he injected a failure that only showed the default recommendations. And we could see in real time, it was a nice GUI. He was looking, it was a live website he was looking at, nice GUI. He said, I'll inject a failure here. We can see what's happening in the monitoring. And I was like, that is super cool, yeah? So they've not open sourced it yet, but the concepts are really nice. And Netflix are a slightly unicorn, maybe, but they're nice to look at for inspiration, yeah? If they're saying some of the Chaos Monkey stuff needs to be changed a little bit, I'm inclined to go, well, that's interesting. I'll pay attention to that as well. Now, in terms of the operational concerns, I mentioned the silos earlier on, the dev to QA to ops, that kind of thing. And it's a little analogy I like to use. I'm not sure if any of you heard it before, but as developers, we often get used to throwing stuff over the wall, yeah? We're not accountable for running stuff in production, necessarily. So we don't feel the pain. And that can lead us to write, crappy code sometimes, that if we run it, we really wouldn't write crappy code because we're responsible. We're getting paged when stuff goes wrong. The analogy is it's kind of like car airbags, yeah? Now, no one could deny that airbags are a fantastic invention. They've saved hundreds, thousands, millions of lives. But there's an argument that it caused people to drive more reckless. Yeah, because if you smash into something, poof, nice balloon in your face, there's probably a minimal risk of death. That's what you're kind of thinking. There is an argument that says we should replace airbags with a spike. Yeah. Now, you imagine you're going down the motorway, 80 miles an hour, and there's a big spike on your steering wheel. You're going to think twice, aren't you, before tailgating? If you have to dap on that brake, poof, yeah, not so good. And this is the kind of notion of dev on call, yeah? The occasional spike to the head is a good thing as a developer. You learn not to write crappy code so much. When I started getting paged, in a previous gig I worked on, started getting paged in the morning because I'd been a bit sloppy with my fault tolerance stuff. I'm like, got to fix it or whatever. Next day I'm making sure I'm writing good code that avoids this kind of thing, yeah? I don't like this pain. And it's not fair to push this onto operators, yeah? Like, developers, we should take responsibility for this. This is kind of, part of what DevOps is all about, yeah? And again, Werner Vogels, Amazon CTO, famously says, you write it, you run it. And that's what they do in Amazon, allegedly. It encourages accountability as a developer, as a development team, I should say, a cross-functional team. It's shared responsibility, and it also promotes communication. Because when stuff starts going wrong, operators can only do so much. Then they might need to engage with QA, they might need to engage with developers, that kind of thing. But it's just this notion of accountability, shared responsibility, and communication. It's controversial. Organizations I go into don't always like it. But I see the value. It's not right for everyone, as with everything here. There's some caveats. But I really like the ideas behind it. Now, our sixth sin is envy, the shared single domain fallacy, the one domain to rule them all. Yeah, that's why I've got the ring up there. Back in the day, when we were doing monoliths, this was actually best practice, yeah? I can't mention names again, but clients we've worked on spent, dare I say it, years perfecting a single domain. Yeah, and it was really hard because I'm really careful not to give away, actually, if I mention a few secrets there, but it's really hard when you've got, quite a complex business, to model one domain to meet all the requirements of that business is really hard, yeah? So we struggled for ages. The thing is with microservices, there's this notion of bounded contexts. So actually, one single domain is kind of an anti-pattern now. And that we spent so long, as an industry, perfecting this one model, it's really hard to break away from. But one model in a microservice environment, it breaks encapsulation and introduces coupling. The anti-pattern I mentioned earlier on, where we had to deploy 2 services at one time because we had the model spread across it, that was an anti-pattern, yeah? That was really one service in disguise. Does that make sense? So, know your domain-driven design. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this today because there's plenty of other great presentations and people that are smarter than I am on this stuff have talked about it. Eric Evans does some fantastic stuff, a quick Google there. But I really have seen the advantage of knowing about entities, value objects, aggregates, what you should expose externally. Like aggregates, you expose the ID externally, but not the ID of other things further down. So like users are famous, so you might want to expose the user ID, but not the address ID of your user, that kind of thing. But do really think about this. But it causes quite a lot of contention within an organization when I introduce these things. Classic question I get is, how do I generate reports? When you've got one monolithic system, typically kicks out to one monolithic database. And regardless of whether you're doing development on the main app and querying the database, or whether you're doing data analytics, it's one database, yeah? So you can do your joins and all that kind of stuff. If you start splitting up stuff into microservices, the good practice at the moment is to, put a single database with a single microservice. You're suddenly splitting up all your data. And this has fantastic benefits in terms of, change management, reasoning about the data, sort of locality. But particularly data analytics people often quite rightly get a bit nervous. I'm going to have to do a join over HTTP. Not a good thing, yeah? But there is patterns to help. So the aggregated reporting pattern, great SOA book there. It's old school. It's kind of an old school SOA book, but it's got some amazing stuff. Because fundamentally, microservices are built on SOA concepts. So don't shun SOA. I really recommend actually people to read about classical SOA, particularly if you're going to start slating microservices online or SOA online or whatever. Do read about the history because a lot of stuff we've kind of done before and we've learned some lessons. So great book, aggregated reporting pattern. It's kind of pull by service. So the pattern there is you have all your bounded context, your individual databases, and you have one other service that reaches in every so often and pulls in the data it needs to build that one database for the querying. People cliche thing, but people call it a data lake. So things like HDFS, people often dump data onto HDFS, process it with Hadoop, that kind of thing, into a database. And so the Lambda architecture is worth a look actually as well, about speed versus batch in terms of processing data. Also interesting is data pumps. Now, Sam Newman, fantastic book about microservices. If you haven't read it, please do. It's an amazing book, actually. As a single book today, if you want to jumpstart your microservice learnings, Sam's that's the book to read, basically. Sam's a great book. But he talks about data pumps and how he pushes events. Yeah. So people event sourcing is kind of hip, kind of popular. CQRS as well. If you know CQRS, it's command, query, responsibility segregation. Very popular pattern. It's kind of nice in that if you're, say, broadcasting events, you can have other things than the intended target listening for them. So if there's an event going through saying, update user 159, change name to whatever, like the user service can be listening for that, but also your data service can be listening for that. So that's quite a nice pattern as well. There's the push or the pull model, and depending on your use case, one or the other is probably quite interesting. These are the answers to the question I often get: how do I generate reports? Or I'm getting a bit nervous here. My database is being sharded, being split up. Because again, it's all about shared responsibility. Yeah, us as developers, we're like, hack up the database. This is amazing. Yeah, got my Liquidbase going on, my flyaway. I'm cool with the schema changes. But the data specialists, maybe not. So check with them, yeah? It's really key. It's a shared thing in the organization. You've got the same goals. Make sure you're not disadvantaging someone by something that's cool for you. So 7, pride. Yes, testing in the world of transients. Now, testing is really hard in microservices. I am not going to lie. Microservices, they are transient at runtime. Things come and go. We've mentioned that already, fault tolerance. But they're also transient in that they're kind of, some people pitch, like Fred, I think Fred Ward pitches that, microservices could be disposable. So you could write one, spend a couple of weeks, use it, then throw it away, that kind of thing. So how do you test that kind of stuff? It's quite a challenge, yeah? Now, people are surprisingly quiet about this. Excuse me. There's so much microservice chatter going on at the moment, but testing is like a really key point, and some people are obviously doing it and doing it well, like your Netflixes, like your Amazons, that kind of thing. But there is a surprisingly little amount of sort of knowledge out there. And I'm chatting to people actually at Yelp, and I'm chatting to people at a couple other places now as well. Hopefully they're going to, Halo are doing some really cool stuff. And hopefully I'm going to get some articles for InfoQ that share how they've set up their testing of microservices. I think it's Yelp in particular do some really cool stuff with Docker, like Dockerizing the data for testing and stuff. And I'd love that to be shared within the community, because I think we need to start talking about this a bit more. The only really solid article around it is the testing strategies by Toby Clemson. And he put it on Martin Fowler's blog. It's a great sort of primer. It talks about like some of the stuff I've talked about, consumer-based contracts, testing at different sort of bits within like a service, and then how do you test services communicating together? Do you mock things? Do you stub things? And it sort of tests, the end-to-end functionality. It's a great primer for a lot of these things. But some of it is deliberately a bit sort of choose the right word, but sort of a bit open-ended. He was like, I can't give you, I can't give you exact rules to follow, because this is kind of, depends on your use case. So it's a great jumping-off point, but don't expect all your answers there. You're probably going to need to experiment in your organization as well. It is difficult. So testing microservices, so invest in your build pipeline testing. Now, I've done this when I was working on monoliths as well and saw the benefits, so I kind of brought it on to a lot of stuff I work on in the microservice domain. I really like Serenity BDD. That was John Smart's stuff he was talking about yesterday. It used to be called Thucydides, but no one could pronounce Thucydides, so it's changed it to Serenity. It's really nice. It's like does like Selenium and other kind of testing frameworks. Really nice wrapper around it. Generates nice reports. I use it a lot actually for project managers, that kind of thing. It's a really cool sort of framework that's good for us as developers doing BDD, outside-in development at a service level and at a global application level. But it gives good feedback to project managers and the business people as well, which is like awesome. Wiremock and Saboteur are really awesome tools, and they don't get enough credit. Tom Akehurst, awesome person from London. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here at the conference now. But his tools there, Wiremock allows you to stub services. It runs like a little mini HTTP server, and you can sort of you can record responses, you can mock responses, that kind of thing. We use it quite a lot with another thing called, I think, Mock Web Server as well, as a newest thing. But it's really cool for sort of faking out services. Whether you're doing local dev, you can mock out other services, or whether you're even running it. We run it in Jenkins as well. We use that Vagrant sometimes to spin up VMs in Vagrant, and then play around like some real services, some fake services, that kind of thing. Really quite cool. Tom also wrote Saboteur, which is kind of, I think I've got actually, that's slightly there. Unfortunately, apologies for the resolution, but Saboteur is a really cool tool for injecting failure into the network stack. So you can like drop packets, you can add latency, you can do all kinds of crazy things. You can like not respond to queries, that kind of thing. And again, we've used it like with we use that actually with VMs and stuff. So it's kind of like a bit of a chaos monkey thing. You can say, if I get this traffic, don't respond. And then you can run it within like a JUnit scenario and say, it should like fall back to a default behavior, that kind of thing. It's a really nice tool for playing around with the network stack to actually trigger failures. And one of Chris Beatty, again from the London Java community, done a couple of fantastic talks. If you Google for Chris Beatty, Skills Matter, London Java community, he talks about how to do this stuff really well. He worked for Sky, actually. I think he's jumped ship now to DataStax, but worked for Sky, and he talks about how they use this kind of technology to actually make sure that even third-party libraries they were using, how did those third parties react under failure? And they famously found some bugs in one of the famous HTTP clients that when you did certain things to the network stack, it would fall over. And they caught that in testing, which I thought was super cool, yeah. And also Jenkins performance plugin. So I use JMeter quite a lot. Gatling's also kind of cool. A few other ones as well. But JMeter, I've got burned in this in a few gigs ago now, where performance of one of our services was gradually going down and down and down and down, and we didn't know it. We didn't have any this kind of testing involved. So now I always recommend we put this in. It's not the massive jump-off, the massive drop-offs even of performance that get you. That's kind of obvious to spot. If you deploy a service and suddenly nothing's responding, it's like, oops, performance issue or whatever. It's the subtle degradation over time that gets you. And that's the same in a monolith, to be honest. You've got to be conscious of this kind of thing as well in a monolith. But you need a good baseline. So I use Jenkins performance plugin. You get these kind of graphs that show, the service started off like this, a few commits that went down, that kind of thing, and it gives you a nice way to track that is the performance of my individual service good enough? And you can also run it at an application level as well on your critical path. So if you're an e-commerce site, for example, your critical path is, can users browse for products? Can users add things to basket? Can they check out? And you might want to be running some kind of JMeter tests, ideally in production, against that kind of thing, and tracking the results. So I mentioned it's hard, and some people are saying now you have to, once you get to a certain scale, this is more an advanced pattern as well, but once you get to a certain scale, you have to test in production. And you look at the unicorn-type people, Netflix, Halo, Guilt, they do that. And Guilt have written some really nice articles recently about how they now really think that they can only test in production. When they've got 200 microservices or whatever, you get emergent behavior. There's multiple teams working on different things at a time. They tried to create staging environments, and it was just chaos, apparently. Different teams had different staging environments. Halo make that work, I think. Different teams, depending on your use case, it sometimes works. But even Halo are leaning, I think, more towards, looking at testing in production. And this is it's kind of a paradigm shift, yeah? And like I mentioned earlier on with Netflix, there's some caveats for doing this. You've got to be quite mature operationally and from a development point of view, but it's worth looking into. As the joke goes, I don't always test code, but when I do, I test it in production. But it must be automated, yeah? Don't use this test in production thing as a mantra for, I'll click a few buttons and it will look good. Don't do that, please. It must be automated. Things like, JMeter or JUnit with Selenium, that kind of thing, or testing APIs. That's great, actually. Selenium can be a little fragile, so testing APIs is actually even better. So, quick summary. We've looked about using the latest and greatest tech. Check whether you and your business can benefit from microservices. It is not a panacea. And if you're going to be doing microservices, do you really need to introduce more tech into the stack? Things like Docker, Mesos, Kubernetes, they are amazing given the right context. Check it works for you. Yeah. Gluttony, excessive communication protocols. If you can, particularly if you're a big enterprise, try and standardize on the glue between your services. Yeah, it makes it so much easier when if you're working on things in isolation, then different parts of the organization come together and try and glue things together. If you're standardizing on something like Rabbit or JSON over HTTP, much easier. Really good. Greed. Do not underestimate the impact that moving to a microservice framework or architecture will have on your organization, both from a business point of view, from an architecture point of view, that kind of thing. Really do think about this. And particularly if your business wants to get a lot of advantage from this, they need to change. They need to get a lot more agile as well. Sloth, laziness. It's all too easy to create a distributed monolith. I've done it, yeah? So please learn from my mistakes. If you can, think about things like your bounded context, your contracts around the edge of microservices, that kind of thing. And again, good architecture, yeah? Wrath, blowing up when bad things happen. You need, bad things happen all the time. You need to test that. Yeah, you need to test that some way at a service level, at a group of service levels, and at your whole application level. As developers, release it is great. As operators, we need to sort of adapt techniques to allow us to test, these kind of things. And again, that shared responsibility, my little joke with the steering wheel and the spike. I know it's a bit sort of poking fun at it, but think about these things. We've all got the same goals in our organization, so we need to work together to ensure this kind of stuff. Envy, like I said, the single domain used to be like, the kind of holy grail in monoliths. It's not in microservices. So think about this stuff. Again, bounded contexts, that is a key thing there. It's a bit of a mindset shift, particularly for big organizations, I've found. And pride. It's all too easy to get a bit prideful in that, my stuff works. But in reality, we all make mistakes, yeah. So we need to think about testing in the world of transients. We need to think testing at a development level, testing at an operational level, and testing at a business level. Are we meeting our objectives? Are our customers happy? That's what we're here for, yeah. Are our end users and customers happy? We need to think about that kind of thing. Bit of a shameless plug before we wrap up. I do write quite a lot for InfoQ, so please, if you want to learn about Docker, Mesos, and Kubernetes, that kind of stuff, I do a lot of stuff. I cover conferences as well, so check it out. I write about microservices for Voxed. I know Mark mentioned Voxed in the keynote. Really cool site, actually. I'm really liking Voxed. Check it out. And the companies I work for, Container Solutions, I write a lot about sort of challenges within companies about using Docker, about using Kubernetes, and success we've had. We do a lot of R&D around that kind of stuff. And OpenCredo, where I do consultancy, I occasionally blog there about sort of interesting challenges we've had. So if you're interested, if you like what you've seen today, I do share stuff regularly, and I love feedback. Yeah, really, this is how it works. Yeah, the reason I do these presentations is partly to sort of clarify my knowledge, but also to get feedback from people. I really appreciate that. I will say, so the team behind me are amazing. Got to shout out everyone at OpenCredo, everyone at Container Solutions, and actually got to shout out not on the high street, my current client, because I'm learning so much with them as well. As much as I'm presenting, there's an amazing team behind me, that is not here with me actually today. And Tarek in particular from OpenCredo, he was the one that came up with the 7 deadly sins idea, and I've kind of stolen it a little bit, yeah. We do different talks with the same title, but I've got to shout out Tarek a lot. He's the CTO at OpenCredo, and he's really helped me with a lot of stuff, actually. So thank you very much. I think we've actually run out of time now, so I'm conscious I'll let the next speaker set up, but I'll be around the conference for the rest of the day. Do come and find me if you've got any questions. I'll be happy to answer them.